of program in the United States was partly made, but they sort of knew that, but actually owned and controlled? I mean, who had executive decisions over how this genre was really generated? Because often it was claimed that this didn't map onto who owned it. And the idea was that I would infiltrate these places by saying, I'm doing research on this particular genre. I'd love to know more about your production practices. And then the union would pay money to grad students working with me who would go in and be able to ask nice, cute questions to cute, famous, powerful people, like Uncle Jack. And I would then publish the results with them, but we would give the skinny, the interpretation, try to get other stories that we would provide the union. And all the people that I tried to contact, and we went through institutional review board release forms and so on, smelled a rat, namely me, and wouldn't do it.
Nitin, what about you?
Well, I think Jen and Toby have really said it. I think that it's doing work in India. It's maybe a little bit different because sometimes it's very, very easy to get access to corporate types, depending where you are. So, for example, Bombay is a little harder now than it used to be because there's more people with MBAs. Delhi, because it's always had this sort of slimy presence of the bureaucracy, has always been a bit easier to get into. So for me, if I made sure, this is one of the problems with the IRB, right? It's not possible to have people sign releases and get any information out of them. And what we have to do as researchers then is transform the information that we have into the type of information that we can use and publish. So you can think about it as moving from the empirical to the anecdotal, right? You have some information, you have a nugget of information, you can't use it and identify the source, so it has to take kind of anecdotal form. I was in the office of the head of UIP in India that had distributed Jurassic Park, which is often seen as the touchstone for Hollywood's rebirth in India, and the figure had been thrown around in the press about 20 million tickets or $20 million or something like that. And he said to me, absolutely straight-faced, that he had completely made the number up. And this happens a lot. It doesn't only happen over there, it happens over here. It happens a lot, right? And especially with numbers. And this is why it's difficult. It's one has to be really wary. And I'm not saying that then our task becomes, we need to somehow verify and find out exactly how many tickets were sold. I mean, if that's the kind of thing that's really important to you, then this may not be the right kind of thing to do, right? But I think that this is an experience that I had quite a bit. There's also you can get some very interesting information and anecdotes from people high up, as well as sort of lower down on the food chain. Oftentimes, much more interesting information about the day-to-day of what goes on. Partially because those people, quote unquote, those people escape the radar of journalism as well. So we just don't read about, let's say, the massive and historically extremely complex informal sector in Bombay film production. It's also very interesting about how you are treated as an academic researcher depending where you are. Toby talked about an experience in LA he had. I had an experience, just two quick anecdotes. One experience, a colleague and I are writing a book on the Indian film industries. And, we had a hard time getting to see some people. But once they found out that the BFI was doing it, it became, we got introduced, and they didn't know we spoke the language. We got introduced to these very, very these honchos of Bombay film production as those British people, right? And they're created a kind of entree. So sometimes, these are really interesting environments to be in. There was another instance where in 2002 I wanted to get access to a film entertainment report that had been put out by Arthur Anderson before they, went belly up. And they had really limited the circulation of this document because it was priced at 10,000 rupees. Absolutely impossible. Even journalists didn't have copies of it. I ended up somehow at the Federation of Indian Chambers of Commerce and Industry chatting with somebody, and they called somebody. I went up to a higher office. They called somebody. I went up to another office, floor by floor by floor, right? And I started, by the time I reached the last office, there were stacks of these 10,000 rupee documents that the Deputy General, they still have these colonial titles, it's fantastic, grabbed and handed over to me. And I realized in the process of my asking questions and him asking questions, he was really interested in what I could do for them as what he thought I was, which was a representative of Hollywood. And it's a very interesting position to be in. I needed the document because I wanted to look at how these big multinationals, this is very early on, how these big multinationals were interfacing with Indian film organizations, producing numbers, beautiful PowerPoint documents, etc., to try to get international investment to come into the country. And so one has to play a role in a particular way at times. I mean, I didn't pull out my card, I didn't have a card, but I didn't disabuse the Director General of his, his mistake. So I think that we do, sometimes what's my point? Sometimes we think of them and us as us, right? And these types of things evaporate when we look at the informal sector, when we look at those people who really work, right? But what I would suggest to people who are interested in doing this kind of work, there are ways, partially, Toby, what you wear for your makeup, etc., right? It's true. And maybe the U.S. is much more managerial and autocratic about these things than if you do your research elsewhere, I think, in a lot of places. But I think there's ways that one can negotiate that kind of performative, interactional environment that we found ourselves in so often, whether that be Uncle Jack's office or in the room with the bell. There are options available, and also if one gets the no, as we so often do, right? We get the wall, or I'm not going to give you this. There are ways sometimes to signify that productively and make that part of. I know that Jenna's done this well. Make that part, that refusal, part of part of your research.
Part of the story.
Absolutely part of the story. Right.
Okay, James.
Just to supplement what I think is a brilliant answer on the personal level, just from the archival side. I mean, Toby's anecdote about being young and cute aside, Rick Jewell's a prime example of he was around when RKO's archive was open, was available, and now it's back in Atlanta and it's closed off, so you can't write that book anymore unless you actually have that backlog. And now that certain studios are looking to their archives and libraries, and I'm just having Eric and step up for a second because this is his backyard. Is there a threat to this type of research being done because it's all being closed down? And so archivally, Warner Brothers Archive aside, Herrick Library Archive aside, what type of work can you do now on an archival basis, given the fact that this is not just personally locked down, but materially you just cannot get into the stacks to see what's there, to make a case and make a narrative?
I think you can try to worm your way in places with personal relationships or personal working a particular relationship. I was allowed into Universal's. There's this amazing facility in Burbank. You would never know. It's like many football fields. Have any of you ever been there? It's just this very nondescript building, and I was working as a research assistant for another professor, and he had a relationship with someone who allowed two of his researchers in, and he said, I don't know how long this is going to last. You guys get in there every day when they open the doors at 8 a.m. and you work. I don't want you taking lunch. You work as much and as fast as you can. I want you just transcribing every single thing until they kick you out. And we were there for a long time, and then literally one day, it was when Vivendi bought Universal and all this stuff happened. The guys came, I was on the Breakfast Club folder, I remember this, I was like typing, and there were deal memos, I mean, there were amazing things, and they just started packing up the files while we were there, and saying, you're gonna have to leave now, and we're gonna take you off the premises, and I was like, but I'm not done, and but we had gotten in there. Researchers aren't really let in there, but we had gotten in there through personal contacts, and I agree that this is the big problem, right? You can't get a hold of this stuff. There's only so many sites like Wisconsin or UCLA Archives, or where you can get a hold of deal memos or research, but they're there. So I think making as many friends as you can with people who might let you in those doors is one hope, because it has happened.
Yep. Just to add to this is my obsession with contemporary research and mainstream. What about the digital? All of these memos, I think, are on email now.
Yeah.
And many of it's, I don't know, I've lost computers 3 times. I used to download my email, I don't do it anymore. It's
Yeah.
all gone. So some of the most vibrant, exciting narratives are in the studio memo, but now how do we negotiate that? A, if you can get access, and B, who's saving all the emails if they've even been saved? So how do you do industrial archival research in the 21st century? Will there be a digital archive? I don't know.
Does anyone else want to?
Well, I think as with what you can trust in any era to do with particularly Hollywood, the best thing to happen is that there's a law case, and a law case that goes a really long way, like was the situation with Alien, for example, or what was the Eddie Murphy film,
Coming to America.
Coming to America, where it either goes to trial or almost goes to trial, lots of things are made public and so on, because actually lots and lots of emails can be found, and there are now lots of anxieties on the part of the big corporations about maintaining emails because of some of the complexities that have come up with privacy issues, with the role of telephone companies and other information service providers and so forth. So a lot more has to be retained now than was the case. Plus a lot more can be found. Are we, as researchers who don't have the state on our side or the corporation on our side, going to be able to get that? Probably not. But the idea that it's all gone, I think, isn't quite as true as that may seem, though I hear what you're saying and I'm with it. But you need a good, juicy law case. I mean, so trying to select research topics that have gone to litigation is always good, because often then you find out, for instance, where the money really went, and you also get made public various, like Selznick memo book, something like that. That's very rich and exciting. The other part of this, of course, is that archives, understood very broadly, are things that were once thought of as a burden only. Sometimes they're now thought of as potentially things you can monetize. You can make money from. I mean, just think about the number of TV shows that were taped and then just taped over for another TV show. Not anymore. And you can take that right the way through to correspondence and so on. In that case, it might not be that it's marketable, but it might be that there are existing laws, or there are likely to be laws that require you to maintain it in the same way as you are required to maintain all kinds of accountancy records for the purposes of audit.
I just want to add one real quick thing to that. I think there's also an opportunity here. Faced with this systematic shutdown, there's a way to think about historiography a little bit differently, right, and constitute that which we think of as the archive and distribute it across different sites, even thinking about archives being site-specific in a particular way. I mean, you mentioned emails. There's still a kind of assumption that there's a site, right? Where are these stored, right? And I think that there's a kind of classic model of archival research